Good morning, everybody. It is morning. What is today? It's January 28th, 2020. We're in the new year. My name is John Solano. If you haven't watched my other videos, you wouldn't know that, so that's who I am. And I have been a professional counselor and therapist for the last 30 plus years. The focus, I guess you could say, or my passion over these many years has been to shed light upon a number of different areas. What I wanted to do today was actually kind of a response to some of the questions that I've received from other therapists and counselors regarding I guess you could say, the research, the techniques, strategies around the topic of addiction. And what I'm going to add to that is its link to trauma, and also the link to the inflamed sense of entitlement and indulgence that we see today. So I've done other videos, and you can find them on my YouTube channel, that address this topic because it's a huge topic, but I wanted to try to really nail something down today in response to the questions that I've received. And again, people are trying to get clear on what is that link, between, if you will, trauma and addiction, and especially between addiction and this inflated sense of entitlement and indulgence. Again, the videos that I've done previously speak into those, but let's see if I can shed a bit more light on it and kind of cut to the chase here for you. Okay, now first of all, we do ourselves a favor by being open to different perspectives. We have to be. I mean, honestly, take a look at the history here of our, well, if you will, humanness in relation to addiction and trauma. I mean, like I said, I've been in the field for over 30 years, and I started out my career as an addictions counselor. And I certainly have seen, like you, my share of drug abuse crises over these many decades, right? If it wasn't heroin, it was cocaine, then it was crack cocaine, then it was meth, then it was crystal, then it was, fentanyl, then it was Oxycontin, then it was, there have been so many of these, if you will, epidemics that have come through our community. And every time these epidemics occur, all the best minds in the community and in the nation and in the world come together and try to come up with solutions. But I haven't really seen a lot of headway here. I don't think we're asking the right questions. Now, there's a tremendous amount of, what do you want to call it, kind of energy focus these days on what I'm going to call, now hang with me here, I'm going to call it the victim narrative. That's not a bad thing, but I think we've been hanging out there for a long time. That's where a lot of our conversations have occurred, in the area of trauma and people feeling victimized. I don't know if that's yielded the kind of results that we had hoped for. I mean, most of us know that if we hang out in the victim narrative, in other words, we know people in our lives, or maybe we've spent time there, really kind of, if you will, licking our wounds and talking about, our frustrations and our heartbreaks and our betrayals and all the things that might constitute trauma, that it's a depleting experience. So what I'm saying here is it's not bad. In fact, it's honorable to acknowledge hurt. But at the same time, we don't want to hang out there. Of course, we want to overcome that. We want to move forward. We want to move on in life. We want to heal that. That's kind of what all this healing and recovery type idea is so important. But of course, when we emphasize a victim narrative, that's very difficult, to create. in terms of a healing or a forgiveness or whatever we're working towards. But anyway, keeping our minds open here as we move forward. And so one of the things that I want to say here, for instance, is think about addiction for a moment and think about trauma and think about human development. One of the things that has really, I guess you could say, come to light or is significantly emphasized these days, especially in relation to social media and technology. Why? Because social media and technology, so many people are using it as a way to try to connect with other people. But statistically, if you will, what we know is that the more time a person spends on social media and glued to technology, actually the more anxious, the more depressed, the more suicidal, the more prone to addiction they become. Because those kinds of connections are really shallow and they're like second best simulated connection. They're not really connection. And so there's a veneer to it all. There's a facade to it all. It doesn't really offer the real thing. And so we've been seeing this now for probably a good couple of decades, and certainly over the last decade. All of us who were in the counseling field, whether you're in high school or whether you're in elementary school, whether you're in college level counselors, whether you're an addictions professional, whether you're a therapist on your own, whether you're, what have you, everybody is seeing huge increases in the population in anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, suicide, and addiction. In fact, very recently, where I work in Surrey, British Columbia, I was approached a couple different times to work with school personnel, youth workers, counselors, administrative people in the school system, high school primarily, to deal with the issue of what they're seeing is huge increases in what they call school non-attendance. There are so many kids now that are, if you will, opting out of school. And why? Oftentimes they say it's because of anxiety that they're experiencing. I think there are a lot of different components that are going on in society right now that are causing us all to be highly anxious. And it happens to be in what I call like a Trojan horse kind of idea where, like say, for instance, social media or technology or whatever it is, where it presents itself as a gift, but embedded in it is a toxicity. And so I think we're experiencing that now. But let me just get back to this idea of what a lot of the discussion is around today is around attachment. So when we talk about human development, you can't really talk about that anymore without talking about what healthy attachment looks like. People are saying now, again, because of the increases that I just spoke of in social media and how it isn't really giving people the connection that they're looking for, but there's research is showing, brain research and different research is all showing, they would say that human beings are wired for connection. Human beings are wired for attachment, real person attachment. So in attachment theory, in counseling, we often talk about disrupted attachment and how disrupted attachment is traumatic, or it can be felt or perceived by a human being as a traumatic experience. Disrupted attachment. What does that mean? Well, that basically means that in attachment theory, it says that if you have when you're born, if you have caring adults in your life and they enjoy the job and they're doing a halfway decent job of it, there's going to be healthy attachment. A person is going to feel, or a child is going to feel like the world is a safe place, that they have value, that they can take risks in the world, that essentially they will have a good, healthy perspective of themselves. So, and a good perspective of the world. So healthy self-esteem, etc. Will have confidence to be about themselves and about their efficacy, their ability to influence their world. Well, when that isn't there, when that's disrupted, people experience trauma. And what happens, of course, was people move forward in life. They experience certain challenges, one might say. So one might have anxiety or depression or bipolar or antisocial, personality traits or what have you. So they say that this disrupted attachment could very likely predispose somebody to those conditions. Where does addiction fit into this? Well, I think one could generally say that as human beings, if we're not getting our attachment needs met with human beings, because we are wired for attachment, we're going to start to attach to other things. Not only are we going to attach to other things, so people get addicted, right? It's almost like what I want to call these days is a hyper attachment disorder. So they become attached to non-human things. And we all know that people can become addicted to anything, right? So we're talking about thoughts, we're talking about processes, we're talking about obviously substances, we're talking about anything, right? And people become super attached to those things. Well, why is it hyper attachment? Well, because it's kind of like when somebody goes without food for a long time and somebody's starving. So if you're starving for attachment, what are you going to do when you finally find something that you can attach to? You're going to go overboard. A starving person is going to stuff themselves. A starving person may very well hoard food too, for the fear of the loss of this source again. So people become overzealous. People become, go overboard with it. They go over the top. And because if you will, attachment, that hyper attachment or now addiction is actually depleting in nature. In other words, all addiction takes more from a person than what it gives. So of course it's depleting, but because the person is not yet, turning towards a healthy attachment, they're going to continue in the unhealthy hyper attachment and continue to get depleted. Isn't that what happens when people use drugs? The more they use, the more they get depleted, and the more they get depleted, the more they use. Tolerance, what have you, builds. There's also, of course, yes, when I say tolerance, physiological changes, to the body and to the brain structures and things like this. So that can be one explanation of the connection between trauma and addiction. That the addiction has to do with the disrupted attachment, that a person has not gotten their needs met from people in the world. So you turn to something else. Now, it's interesting when we start to talk about, well, then what's the link between trauma, if you will, addiction, and then this whole indulgence, entitlement and indulgence thing? Well, you actually have to insert this conversation between the between the attachment issue and the trauma. So we've linked attachment and trauma, but if we slow it down frame by frame, we're going to see something quite different, and it's very unique to human beings. I would almost say that it's a human being only phenomena or dynamic. If it's not, the human beings are at the top of the chart, if you will, when it comes to this dynamic around feeling entitled and then indulging. Now, I have to stress how deeply this is in our psyche. People just refuse oftentimes to want to acknowledge the depth that this dynamic exists within the human psyche. But it was interesting. I was reading, and maybe you've seen this YouTube video, and it basically says how to spot a liar. And there's a woman who obviously has much training in this area, and she's talking about how not only do you spot a liar, but what I found really interesting was she kind of gave the history, like the human history on lying. And developmentally, when as human beings do we, if you will, start being deceptive? And so basically she said two things. Three things. One, human beings have been doing this forever, not telling the truth. I guess you could say two, we all do it in different ways, in different stages. A lot of times it's not even conscious to us. And the greater the neocortex, if you will, in a mammal, the greater the propensity for lying. And she broke down, like she showed, basically from birth, up through different ages of when we as human beings actually consciously begin to be deceptive, to not tell the truth, and what it looks like at different ages. And what I found noteworthy in terms of this discussion in that video, I hope you look at it, is that it speaks to how deeply within the human psyche that human beings can be deceptive. It's in our nature to be deceptive. It's in our nature to not tell the truth. Even when we know what the truth is, we will not tell the truth. And so that's a helpful understanding because, we're being told one narrative, one story about addiction. One story could be, that all addiction is a result of trauma. That's the traditional story that's being told. But I want to suggest that there is a different story to tell, or another piece of the story that needs to be told. There is in many ways a deception. Now, again, I've been counseling for over 30 years, and I guarantee you, and I've designed theory and curriculums and programming in order to address this. In order to address what? In order to, to help people become more aware, more conscious, if you will, of subconscious, self-defeating patterns, if you will, in their mind. In other words, how people can be their own worst enemy. I truly believe that in my own life, and as I've worked with other people, most of the times people are their own worst enemy. Most of the times when people are in agony or in suffering, it's not, the source of that suffering is not what they say it is. Somebody may be blaming their son or daughter for their agony, but then you look a little deeper, and what's really the cause of the agony? It's a belief that the parent holds. It's a belief that the parent holds. It's like a parent saying, I'm so frustrated and disheartened because my son or daughter doesn't respect me. And I might say to the parent, do you even know what respect means? Well, respect, of course, means that they, when I ask them to do something, that they do it, that I get some cooperation. You see, that's the traditional understanding of respect. And I say, well, no, actually, respect doesn't mean that. If you look at what respect actually means, the RE on the front of the word means again, and spect means to look. So when you ask somebody for respect, you're actually asking them to look again or to consider something. It doesn't mean obedience. So the agony that you're experiencing is not because of what your son and daughter is doing. It's actually because of the position or the perspective that you have. Your idea is causing you agony. And it's not even what you want anyway with your son or daughter. You can't raise an independent son or daughter. They can't stand on their own 2 feet if all you want for them is to be a carbon copy of you. And that's exactly what would happen if they just obeyed you. So no parent in their right mind wants their child to obey without question, because then you're robbing them of being an authentic human being, which is exactly what you want as a parent. So let's tell the truth. You see, there's something untrue about what's going on. So thank you for bearing with me as I try to explain this and illustrate that this unique, if you will, capacity for self-deceit is deeply embedded in the human psyche. It's a capacity that we have. In other words, and the smarter we are, if you will, the bigger that neocortex, the more likely we're going to do it and the more sophisticated our deceptions are. But let's slow this down then. Let's take another perspective and slow this down. Okay, let's add to the discussion. Maybe based upon a little bit of this attachment idea. When we come to this world, what are we? We're called infants, right? If you were to call someone, an adolescent or an adult, if you were to call them infant-like or infantile, what would you be saying about them? You would be basically saying that this person is narcissistic, egocentric, and grandiose. Now, we have a framework, we have an understanding that the core of the human psyche, remember, not only are we deceptive, but the core of the human psyche contains major components of narcissism. It has to. You think, that first of all, when we're developing our consciousness, the world does literally revolve around us. Our consciousness begins to form at the little minuscule pieces of the consciousness, of our own consciousness as it grows. The most fundamental pieces are when we're in the womb. And literally, we did not even have to breathe for ourselves. Everything was taken care of. Any need we had, mostly, if you will, biological at that point, and some emotional as well, but we were in this perfect environment. The world did literally revolve around us, and anytime we needed anything, it was instantly taken care of. All our needs were met. And once we're born, what is an infant's main preoccupation? Survival. So the psyche has an intense, solid kind of agenda. It is what we call I, me. Because I have to think about me, and I have to think about me very intensely. Otherwise, I'm going to die. If you notice, like attachment theory, the word attachment is not a warm and fuzzy word. It's not bonding theory. It's attachment theory. Babies are born with a grasping response and a sucking response. Why? Because if they don't have that, they're going to die. So the psyche's intense preoccupation when we're young is an I-me focus. It's narcissistic and egocentric and grandiose. There seems to be, I know you'll agree, but there seems to be biologically, there seems to be psychologically, even archetypally, there seems to be this, and culturally, etc., there seems to be this belief that when children are born, all their needs need to be met. We talk about this a lot, don't we, in psychology? We all have needs, and our needs need to be met. And when I'm young, attachment is the big deal. So I talk about my needs for attachment because it has a lot to do with my physical and psychological survival. Now, what we talked about before is that when those needs aren't met, that can register as a traumatic experience. But then we have to ask ourselves, maybe a couple questions, but first of all, what is a trauma? Like when we look at trauma, can be all sorts of different traumas. But just to say, when we're talking about human development, let's say, and we talk about having needs, and we talk about having needs that go unmet, and that could be perceived as traumatic, aren't we basically saying is that what really trauma is, and this is a bit of a definition that I use sometimes, trauma is an abrupt separation from my expectations. Now, an abrupt separation from my expectations. So if I have intense expectations that that my needs are going to be met, that people are going to show up in a particular way for me, that people are going to be loving and caring and sensitive and kind and adore me and all these kinds of things, if I'm expecting that and it doesn't happen, that's a traumatic experience. You know, when I look into trauma from that perspective, and I talk to people about trauma all the time, and I've done my own process work around trauma, I find there's really kind of a couple of things. You know, there can be where people have experienced neglect or abuse or etc. Something was done to them. So let's say, for instance, a child experienced a lot of corporal punishment. They were hit a lot by their parent. They might be mad, you know, they might be hurt, mad, what have you, about what was done. In other words, what was done was that they were hit. But the deeper disappointment, if you will, the deeper trauma, if you will, the deeper hurt is really connected to this. What hurt is that this person was not being what I expected them to be. I expected my mom to be tender. I expected my dad to protect me. I expected my dad to be. And because they weren't being what I expected, they did this. Right? What we do comes from who we're being. And so what a person did, or what a person experienced physically, if you will, has its hurt, but that's more easily forgiven than the underlying hurt of that who I expected this person to be for me, they weren't. This person was being mean. This person was being cruel. This person was being unfair. This person was being insensitive. This person was being uncaring. That's what I'm most disappointed by. Because we deeply expect people to be something positive for us, or what we would consider positive, and our needs being met. So then the question is, okay, well, could that be? I asked you to see if you could entertain a new idea around this. Can you entertain this idea? Can you think about this as a possibility? That one definition of trauma is an abrupt separation from my expectations. Right? Think about it this way. You know, you're driving through an intersection, right? Your light's green. All of a sudden, somebody comes from the side who had a red light and they T-bone you. You expected what? To be able to get through that intersection freely, right? The light was green. You thought you were going to be safe, etc. All of a sudden, you're T-boned, you know, your car's hit. Maybe your body is a little bit bruised and injured in the accident. Well, a month later, 2 months later, your body's all healed up. But psychologically, if you will, when you move through that, go through intersections now, you're experiencing anxiety, right? Well, again, the body's gotten over it, but the mind hasn't. So what is the traumatic experience? You know, it's a sense of shock, right? It's like, you know, I expected this and this didn't happen. If you were in a demolition derby and you got T-boned, but you expected it, your body would be bruised up. You'd heal. And psychologically, you wouldn't be traumatized. You wouldn't be hurt. Why? Because you expected it. The physical kind of, you know, technicalities of what occurred are the same. But because the expectation was different, you know, it creates two different narratives. In fact, you know, your car might have been T-boned and you might have been bruised up a little bit in the demolition derby, but you might still win the race. So here you are all bruised up, but now you've got a smile on your face holding up a trophy and you feel great about yourself. Your body's still as bruised as before. Again, you see where I'm going with this? It's the expectation that caused the trauma. So, what happens then? What's the psychological dynamic when we expect something to happen We expect people in our lives to be something for us, and they let us down. Now, remember, we're also narcissistic, egocentric, and grandiose. We're infantile. We think the world should revolve around us and that people should really be there for us, and they're not. Right? So, imagine this. This is a story that I tell all the time to illustrate this. You've got, let's say, little Susie. She's born expecting this big party, people to embrace her, to adore her, etc. It's not happening. This is a common story for many, many people. This is life. Everybody gets dealt a hand of cards. Every client that I work with, every family that I work with, have a hand of cards to play. And that hand of cards is usually something, tough that happened in their histories, around their relationships and around the attachment and the connectedness. In other words, people disappoint. People don't show up. People don't meet other people's needs, in the way that you had hoped, in the way that you expected. So you have little Susie here who's born, and she's born to a single mom. She has no idea where her dad is. Let's say mom is trying to do the best that she can do to raise little Susie. So she has to work. So she has a job, but she has to leave Susie with different friends and family members for care. All right? So what do you think, imagine a child like this maybe being put in foster care or other places like this. It's like, what does a child learn very early in life? Well, if people aren't going to step up for me, if people aren't going to protect me, if people aren't going to care for me, if people don't want to be with me, I guess then I have to learn how to take care of myself. So people learn that really early in life. But this is a child who has to learn this lesson. So you learn this lesson. Hey, the only one I can trust is myself. The only one who's going to take care of me is me. I got to learn this. I got to learn how to take care of myself. Yeah, but you're only like 2 years old, 3 years old, little Susie. Well, it doesn't matter. Somebody's got to take care of me. And if I don't do it, then, I'm hurting. So I got to learn how to take care of myself. So now Susie steps up into more of an adult role to take care of herself. When Susie steps up into an adult role, what does Susie leave behind? She leaves behind her childhood and everything that childhood is supposed to represent. What is childhood supposed to represent? Very little accountability and responsibility, lots of play, hanging out with friends, just doing silly stuff. Childhood is supposed to be a magical time of life. You open the refrigerator, there's food. Hey, I don't know how that got there. That's magical. Look at my clothes. They're clean. That's magical. Look at they're folded and put away. That's magical. Oh, look, there's a new bike here or a swing set or whatever. Oh, that's pretty magical. I didn't have to do anything for it. Hey, I broke this toy. Oh, that gets fixed or replaced. Wow, that's kind of a magical thing. Oh, I threw a baseball through a window. Oh, that gets cleaned up. That gets taken care of. That gets repaired. That's pretty magical. I didn't have to do anything. That's what childhood is. So when a child steps up into what they feel is an adult role, why? Because people didn't meet their expectations. Of course, that can feel traumatic, right? But people step up. So now little Susie's learning how to take care of herself. In the process, though, she is what? She has lost her childhood. So now here mom's going on, mom's living life or whatever. Let's say she finally meets somebody or what have you, a partner, and there's another child born. Now little Susie is, 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, let's say, and now she's got a little sibling to take care of. Mom's still out there working and doing her thing, and she's anxious, maybe depressed some of the time. Who knows, maybe using substances or preoccupied with her own indulgences. But now little Susie has to take care of a little sibling. Well, what would happen if little Susie didn't? Well, that sibling would go without. They would, be hungry. They would have dirty clothes. They wouldn't get to school on time. They would be harassed. They would be bullied. They would be, I was just speaking with a client, this is routine, but I speak with clients all the time who tell me this very story, how they had to raise siblings because they had a parent or a lack of parenting, lack of adults, or a parent who was incapacitated or whatever it was, and they had to step up and take care of that younger sibling. Now, this Susie is not happy. Do you get it? Susie is not happy about having to take care of her sibling. She's caring for her sibling under duress, right? Because if she doesn't do it, something bad is going to happen. That's Susie's story to begin with. Susie made a choice to say that, hey, if people aren't going to step up for me, then I have to step up for me. Why? Well, because if I don't, something bad is going to happen. So I'm taking on this responsibility, not because I want to, but because I have to, because I'm under duress. If I don't, something bad will happen. So Susie does it. You see what's going on there? Susie does it against her will. It's not really what she wants to do. But she does it because because something bad will happen if she doesn't. Okay, little Susie's 7. She's got a sibling who's 3, has to be taken care of. She's stepping up to the plate. She can't hang out with her friends. On a snowy day in the wintertime, she's at the kitchen and doing some dishes and getting some lunches ready. She looks out the window and sees little Julie and Billy out there doing snow angels and drinking hot cocoa. Little Susie can't join them, right? Just one more disappointment, one more piece of her childhood that she's been robbed of. But the story goes on. Now here's little Susie. She's now 12, 13, just about going into high school. There's another sibling that comes along, right? Now these 2 siblings have to be taken care of. You see how the story goes. Now all of a sudden, Susie's 17, 18. Those siblings are old enough to take care of themselves. She says to herself, why wouldn't they be? She had to take care of herself when she was 3, 4, 5 years old. She had to step up to the plate. So why shouldn't they be able to do that as well? Susie's been putting up with this, right? She's been tolerating this most of her life. And she's done this against her will, and consequently, she's been robbed of most of her childhood. Finally, Susie says, I've had enough. I'm done. You guys are on your own. I did this when I was when I was your age. I took care of myself. You can do it now. Mom's not too happy about that decision, but Susie doesn't care now. She's had enough of Mom as well, not stepping up to the plate. What do you think Susie's saying to herself now? What is it time for? It's time for a vacation. It's playtime. You see, because when we do something against our will, we're not okay with that. We don't let it go. When we feel robbed of something, what immature justice looks like is that we want what was taken from us, we want it back, and we want it back with interest. Right? An immature person, when robbed of something, what do they want? They want it back, and they want revenge. They want to make the perpetrator pay. And they want to make that perpetrator not only feel as bad as they felt, but even feel worse. They want to bring that perpetrator to their knees. I see this every day. Kids, men and women, getting revenge on one another. Kids trying to show their parents who's boss, or kids making their parents' life hell. Why? And I ask them, your parents say that you're making their life hell. And they'll say, yeah, you're right, I am. Well, why is that? Well, because they made my life hell when I was little. Parents going through divorce, whatever it is. Had a parent who was substance abuser, never around, neglectful, abusive. Yeah, they didn't care about me, so why should I care about them? They didn't care to understand what I was saying. Why should I take the time to understand what they're saying? That is the immature mind. That is the kind of thinking that's connected to the narcissism, the egocentricity, and the grandiosity. Right? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Live by the sword, die by the sword. That's the mentality. But now, little Susie feels what? She feels like she's entitled to her vacation. Why? Because she had to work hard already. She's worked hard most of her life. So now she's entitled. You see that? You see how trauma, when people feel that their needs haven't been met, that they actually, that their needs have been totally neglected, or they feel robbed of something, it inflames that sense of entitlement that is embedded in the narcissism, in the grandiosity, in the egocentricity. See, that entitlement, that feeling of entitlement is there. Just like this woman said in the video about people who are deceitful. That capacity to deceive, that capacity for revenge is deeply, deeply, deeply embedded in the human psyche. And it is very active just by the very nature that we have these huge neocortexes. Right? So now you've got a person who feels highly entitled to what? To getting back what they were robbed of. Plus interest. Right? So let's say that Susie, like she put up with this for a long time. But, somewhere down the road, obviously, she was going to be freed. She was going to be, no longer have these responsibilities. So Susie had to put off for many years what she wanted. But she didn't want to have to do that. She didn't want to have to wait many years to get her needs met, to get what she wanted. You see, that's a capacity that we want to have in children, that we want to kind of plant the seeds for. But when we get it too early and it's against our will, and we're not getting our other needs met, what I'm talking about is delayed gratification. So now Susie says, what? Screw this delayed gratification crap, right? I want what I want, and I want it now. I'm into instant gratification. Well, what's going to give me my instant gratification? What's going to give me my instant playtime? The vacation. And it's not just a physical vacation. It's a vacation of psychologically. Because remember, this was all done under duress. And these adult roles that were taken on by a child, where they were anxious, they were freaked out, and depressed. Depressed by the heavy load that they were carrying. So the physical, they might be free physically, but emotionally, psychologically, oh no. They're still experiencing anxiety, depression, dread, things like this. So I want instant gratification. I'm entitled to it. Well, what's that instant gratification going to come in? It's going to come in the form of indulgences. Well, what are indulgences? Indulgences are things that we do that we know we shouldn't do. But all indulgences are seductive, just like drugs, for instance. There's an instant payoff, and that makes it seductive. It also may be easy to get. It may be something that I can have control over, whatever it is. But it's all about instant gratification that I feel entitled to. And it's indulgent because I know that it's what I'm about to do is not what I should be doing according to my inner, what I call code of honor. Those convictions, those values, beliefs that I hold dear. So every time I indulge based upon a feeling of entitlement. I feel entitled to this. Yet what I'm entitling myself to is going against my core values and virtues, which causes anxiety and depression. But I medicate that with further indulgences. Every indulgence is really a diminishing experience and ultimately life-taking. If I continue to indulge, if I continue to do things that are not a true reflection of who I really am and what I believe, I will be constantly in a state of anxiety. And every time that I'm in anxiety and I use another indulgence to cover that up, then I just become more anxious and more depressed. Like an addiction spiral. But this is where indulgences lead. Anybody who's involved in any kind of indulgent activity, like say for instance, if somebody's indulging in anger, indulging in anxiety, indulging in whatever it is, like psychologically or physically, it'll lead to adverse consequences. That's why I always say to parents that I work with and clients, how would you know if what you're doing has integrity or not, or whether it's indulgent or not? Well, I say, look at the scoreboard of your life. Are you winning or are you losing? Are you feeling more revitalized or are you feeling diminished? You'll know, because where there's smoke, there's fire. So I'm gonna leave this video here right now. I gotta actually go and see a client. But I hope I appreciate that this was a long video, but I really want people to begin to shift some positions on this, so we can slow this down frame by frame and start to see that actually it's a dynamic of entitlement and indulgence that's really has its roots all the way down into our infantile self, our narcissism, egocentricity, and grandiosity. That is a precursor, ends up being a precursor to addiction. We tend to look at addiction, in some of its more obvious manifestations. But if we start to be able to see that the true dynamics there around, again, the narcissism and the entitlement and the indulgence, and how that all gets so inflamed when people's needs aren't met, attachment needs aren't met, then we can begin to do something about that. Now, I'm not sure, I don't think we can do anything about the human condition. It basically is, like I said, there's narcissism and built into all of it. So there's some part of us that's always about ourselves. And when we're too much about ourselves, we're obviously not going to meet other people's needs. Everybody knows that. That's part of growing up. That's part of the big, what I call divine irritation that we experience when we're kids and adolescents. We finally realize that our parents aren't perfect and the world isn't perfect and it's not going to meet all of our needs. And that's what we call growing up and maturing. And we have to start looking at other sources of wisdom and knowledge in order to, to continue to be healthy and happy. But that's a whole other discussion about, if you will, the bigger archetypal picture of the existence of trauma and why it would be that way. There's no end to it. There's no stopping it. But there are things we can do, and of course those things that we can do are well documented in so many different wisdom teachings, and that's again a whole other discussion as to why as a society we're not turning to wisdom teachings to deal with this epidemic, if you will. So appreciate your feedback, appreciate you listening. I'm going to head out of here, get on with it, and tune into the channel, subscribe, and I'll keep posting these videos for you. Take care. Have a good day.